Hello everyone and welcome to this Show Home Live panel discussion in which we'll be discussing biophilic design and the idea of building homes and new developments in harmony with nature. I'm joined by two expert professionals within this field, Ludovic Pitié, Director of Landscape and Open Design at WSP, and also Oliver Heath, founder of Oliver Heath Designs. Thank you both for joining me today at this session.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joe, for inviting us.
Before we delve into the topic of biophilic design, we'll be covering three main sections. So looking at the benefits to building with nature, the current landscape around it, and also the concept of biophobia. I'd just like to begin with both of you explaining for us what biophilia or what biophilic design means specifically to you.
Okay, great. Well, thank you for the introduction. So biophilia quite literally means a love of nature. And it's a term that was kind of first invented in around the 1970s, 80s by Erich Fromm and Edward O. Wilson, when they recognized society's departure away from rural dwellings and into city centres, and the many physiological and psychological problems that started to happen. Biophilia essentially looks at humans' innate desire to be more connected with nature and natural systems. And when we bring it into the built environment, it's known as biophilic design. So it's how we enhance human-nature connections in the built environment. And it's partly about, bringing real forms of nature in, like natural light, fresh air, water. It's also in part about how we mimic nature using natural materials, colors, and textures. And it's also remembering that it's an evolutionary design ethos. So it looks at how humans evolved in nature to survive and thrive, and remembers that we need spaces that are exciting and stimulating to get us up and out, but also spaces that are calm, relaxed, safe, and secure.
Thank you very much, Oliver. And what about for you, Ludo? How would you define biophilia and biophilic design?
Yeah, I come at it from a slightly different standpoint, and I'm not going to repeat Oliver's answer because it's spot on. I'll give you my take on it, which is my story of how I got into biophilic design, which really I came at it first from the urban design perspective, so looking to design streets and public spaces, and almost by osmosis working with landscape architect and starting to understand the benefits of nature in the built environment. And it's only really when we started to work more together that we started to realize and unlock a lot of the potential. And importantly, there's been a lot of great reports in the UK about the value of parks and the value of open spaces on property and on health and well-being. And that was kind of my introduction. So I came at it far more from a landscape perspective, so from the outside of the buildings, and valuing nature in the city angle, and then realized that actually there was something that had been developed all this time that was called biophilic design that actually helped qualify and quantify that framework, that it wasn't just something that landscape architects and urbanists were championing in cities, that actually there was a real evidence and correlation between what made logical sense as landscape architect, but actually there's a clear scientific framework that has been developed that correlates how you can, what kind of design interventions you can put together to amplify the human response and benefits on the other end. And I think that is the realization I had back in 2016, and I haven't looked back ever since. And really, for me, biophilic design is completely interchangeable with landscape architecture. It's operating and thinking at different scale, from inside of the building to outside of the building to the neighborhood and to the city. So I see it more as a philosophy more so than just a design approach.
I think that's a really interesting point you've just made there about the fact that biophilic design does extend from the interior very much into the exterior, and therefore it's a design concept that can be integrated into new homes, but also across new developments and communities. And I think this is something that we'll be discussing in more detail a bit later on.
Yeah, just to bring that idea to life, because it's a really enticing idea, is that we like to think that, you know, contact with nature is a little bit like a sort of a dose of good well-being. And, you know, what's interesting about our conversation today is that, you know, it's often thought about as being biophilic design a thing that happens inside buildings. But of course, it's important that we create that kind of continuous green thread of well-being throughout the occupant experience. And we tend to talk of biophilic design as a sort of nature diet triangle, in as much as, you know, we need continuous little touch points with nature throughout our day, but maybe deeper, richer connections across every week, every month, or every year. So if you think about it, you know, we go on holiday once or twice a year and we immerse ourselves in the beach and the mountains and the forest, and that's a really deep, rich nature immersion. So not only should we think about it like that, just that really big, deep one, but also how we have those continuous touch points across a range of different spaces, from, you know, the scale of a country to a county, to the size of a town, a neighborhood, a street, and your own home. So think about it as a range of different spaces and across a range of different times, that we need those continuous touch points of nature to support our physical and mental well-being.
And I think the interesting point within that, Oliver, is that with the rate of urbanization that we've seen and with the increased population living in cities, if 90% of our time is spent indoors, we're all only just going to thrive more nature and more nature contact and more natural connections and experiences, right? And that's something that we've all experienced personally during COVID, when we're all locked up in our homes during all those lockdowns repeatedly. And like the first relaxation that happened, everyone flocked the parks, right? So that was the first thing that happened when we were allowed out, was everyone turning up to the green spaces. And I think everyone has realized on a personal level that connection, that what we mean by biophilia. I think we've all experienced it globally during those lockdowns, and it helped in a way convert a lot of people who maybe didn't understand what we were talking about, because they've experienced it themselves now. So we're able to point to that singular experience as to what does that lack of connection brings, because while sometimes it can be difficult to people to explain the value of being in nature, but being able to have that unifying collective experience as to what the lack thereof means is also a great way to help rally people around that concept, because people have got a different level of awareness and understanding of well-being and health, right? And is often assumed that we all have the same, but actually it's not at all. It varies massively across communities. And so I think being able to come at it from a unifying standpoint of bringing nature as an equalizer of experiences, but also across socioeconomic backgrounds, to say that, you know, we should all have access to nature, because our collective health and well-being really is related to it, and being able to almost use that as a way to bring communities together, because actually that the benefits go far beyond health and well-being.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting thing to sort of mention, is that biophilic design is in a way a universal design ethos. You think about many other design styles, whether it's, you know, Gothic or classic or postmodernism or modernism, people have very, very different views and feelings about those different styles of the design. The one thing that everybody kind of agrees on is they like to be in nature, and ultimately it makes them into a better person. So of all the ways that we could be designing with nature and enhancing it in our built environment is a good way to attract a far greater cross-section of the society, whether that's across different geographic regions or cultures, even religions.
I think we do all share this sort of common natural attraction to nature, and we are also aware of the primary benefits to it, to our physical and our mental health, and also to obviously for the environment. What are some of the other benefits?
Okay, well, as Ludo inferred earlier, the biophilic design is an evidence-based approach. So there are 30 years of empirical research data sets and studies that demonstrate again and again across multiple building types that bringing nature into the built environment is good for people and actually it's good for profits as well, if that's a bit work for you, which it probably shouldn't be. So in residential settings, actually there's a £2,500 increase on the average UK home that's 100 metres away from green spaces, as opposed to 500 metres away. And actually 10% increase in tree canopy can decrease violent crime by 15%, decrease property crime by 14%. And across many, many different building types, we see these sorts of essentially improvements on kind of building value and a reduction on some of the negative consequences. So in workplaces, for instance, it's been shown to increase productivity by between 6 and 15%, whilst reducing absenteeism and staff turnover. In healthcare spaces, patients get better faster when they can have views looking out onto nature, and they even feel less pain when recuperating in natural light. So again and again, we see these studies demonstrating that improvement on intended outcomes and a reduction in some of the sort of negative issues that many buildings experience as a result of a buildup of stress and potential burnout. So, these nature connections are really good for just putting people in a better physical and mental state of mind to do whatever it is that they're supposed to be doing in these spaces.
And Ludo, I imagine that there would be also some benefits on a more sort of societal level. What could you tell us about that?
So, I mean, the benefits are almost infinite. That's the beauty of the benefits of nature, right? When we take it right back to the beginning, nature contributes moderately to highly to over 50% of the world's GDP. So we don't even realize how far nature goes in our lives, but our entire economic system is built on it, right? So I think one of the benefits of the idea of building with nature is helping reveal and amplify those connections and those benefits with intent from the very early days of the master plan through the design process. And there's some great projects out there who have very much put regenerative design and or biophilia and nature at the heart of new developments, right? So it's not like we're saying it's a good idea because we're championing it. it's something that very much the industry is getting behind, right? And I think from a broader benefits perspective, there's some great statistics on the benefits of green spaces in the UK in general, right? So great study by the Fields in Trust that did research that identified that collectively across the entirety of the UK, the use of parks and green spaces contributed to over 34 billion of our collective health and well-being every year. And so it's not just on singular home or single occupier or promoter. It's as society we benefit completely from it because it's savings to the NHS, right? And actually, if we were doing more of that, there would be more savings thereafter, right? So the biggest difficulty is about connecting the two ends, right? The person that promotes the investment in nature isn't always the beneficiary. Mm. And that's really is the biggest challenge in trying to advocate for nature. And that's one of the big opportunities in biophilic design in development is actually being able to help crystallize those 2 points, because in any other locations, in any other settings, it becomes a lot harder to get the beneficiary to actually invest in it because the two are completely disconnected. So I think there are many instances when nature benefits us all, right? Nature-based solutions for climate adaptation and resilience, all the way through to how we're able to build more circular systems, embracing the circularity of nature, because nature invented circularity anyway. So there's myriads of examples, but fundamentally, I think it really comes together in this setting where we're able to amplify the intent right from the beginning. And that's a huge opportunity that we have, and it's being able to realize that doing so isn't just good for the initial bottom line, but it's all good long term to be a good steward of the communities you're creating. And it's maybe a slight shift in perspective perspective and ambition from your sort of value and corporate business plan. But if it's one of them, then naturally building with nature becomes almost a default, because nature becomes a steward of that community and vice versa.
I think it's worth sort of elaborating on what biophilic design is, because it's essentially considered a human-centered approach. So it's how do you improve the human experience of the built environment by bringing nature in. And I think at the time that it was first invented and discussed, that was, of course, of absolute importance, and it still is. But now I think with the advance of the climate crisis and biodiversity loss, we need to think a little bit bigger and think about how we can harness that human-centered benefit to take the conversation a little bit wider. And as sort of Ludo's discussing, I think particularly when you get into the realm of urban design and landscape design, then we have the opportunity to create mutualistic benefits of introducing nature that will improve the quality of the experience for the occupant, but also help to mitigate biodiversity loss and the climate crisis. And I think we're getting to a point slowly where we're seeing these two areas converge, and it's taking us away a little bit just from the sort of pure kind of approach to biophilic design being human-centered, and thinking, well, how do we use that, and that sort of recognition that we all like to be around nature, we want it to be near our homes, our offices, our hospitals, and how do we then sort of use that to encourage a greater understanding and desire to bring nature in across all of our built environment, not just for us, but to help create a more resilient built environment.
Well, 100%, Oliver. And I think, and that going back to the conversation where at the very beginning before the recording, that was evident at Future Build. There's so many suppliers and companies and contractors out there who have really started to embrace the fact that in order to face the multiple crises that we have, net zero and nature positive and circularity and embracing sustainable actions and transition plans is fundamental, not just for the bottom line, but for our collective futures. And I think there's a real pivot now to seeing how all those things connect, and thinking beyond the silos of let's just look at some net zero here and look at some BNG here. Actually, all those things are synergistic, and we need to start to combine the thinking to look more broadly at what can we do that's actually collectively better, both for climate, for nature, for social equity, for our health and community resilience, as well as climate adaptation. And it starts, the connections are infinite, because the solutions are so deeply connected around nature as well, which makes for a lot more synergies in addressing those holistically.
I think from what you've both been saying there, you sound quite optimistic that perhaps over recent years we are seeing more progression and more house builders and developers realizing the benefits to biophilic design and incorporating nature more and more into their developments. Could you possibly give us, Ludo, an example or a case study of a recent biophilic development?
Yeah, I can even give you two. I think there's a couple of great examples. So the first one is, I would say, the Earls Court Master Plan. Really fantastic work by SLA, a sort of a nature design studio, as they've branded themselves, from Denmark. And the work they've done there on the Earls Court Master Plan, they initially had 40% of the site not built, that was dedicated to gardens and open space. And following the consultation and the engagement, they've increased that further by another 20% to 60% of the site being for nature. And really, the entire vision from the get-go was built around nature and nature connectivity through the site, and the experience of the residents was kind of at the heart of it. And I would say it's a brilliant example of, even in the most highly and densely built and populated parts of the UK, you're still able to put nature at the heart of your master planning process. And It's out for consultation. Anyone interested? There's the Earth Core Development Company website has the master plan out there for consultation for anyone to see, and it's the amount of nature in it is quite astonishing. It's almost to the level of the Olympic Park, except it's so much closer to central London, and it's far more constrained because it's on the deck as well. So it's really quite inspiring. And the other one I would say is probably the Phoenix in Lewes. Really good example on a brownfield site, with regenerative design being at the heart of the approach, and that was very much championed by human nature, the developer themselves, right? They brought a brilliant team, a collective. So they've got over 12 different architects, I think, on the overall design team. So bringing that collaborative approach to draw in on every different designer's strength and perspectives, and doing as much embracing circularity and a lot of those nature principles from the outset. So it's not just about how do we bring nature into the materiality of the space, but really from first principle, how do we create a place that is sustainable, that can sustain itself, its resident, and be resilient to climate, and everything else kind of flows with it. And it's really a great example of how those things come together.
And Oliver, is there anything that you could add?
Yeah, I would second you on the Phoenix project. It's worth taking a look at that. It's a really fascinating. Unfortunately, it's groundbreaking in this day and age, but it really is. It's going to be a fantastic scheme, and I think it's just got planning permission as well.
It did last week or 2 weeks ago. Yeah.
Project we're working on at the moment with John Lewis, where we are their biophilic design some partners. What we're doing is working with John Lewis, who are creating build-to-rent apartments, and we are looking at how we can create that continuous thread of well-being throughout the project by connecting with nature. So I think unusually what we're doing is we're working across different silos of industry professionals, from the urban designers to the landscapers to the architects through to the interior designers, but also with the likes of the facilities managers and the general kind of project stakeholders. The idea being is that nature shouldn't just be like, well, you're in a park, of course you're going to be, engaged with nature. How do you continue that sense of well-being and think about the way people feel in a space? So, we're thinking about how we bring nature connections in, and it's not simply enough to put a few shrubs and trees. It's how do you actually facilitate a good, rich, meaningful experience in nature by getting people to stop and to sit and thinking how we want them to feel, continuing that journey through into reception and circulation spaces, into sort of public podium spaces externally or even internally, and continue that journey right through to the individual apartments. Because that sense of well-being, as Ludo said, we spend 90% of our lives indoors. That well-being connection to nature shouldn't just be something that we're thinking of as in a landscape, but also throughout this whole journey and experience. So, we're getting down to the sort of realms of, well, how do we design a space that supports good sleep? Well, partly that's through having a good amount of natural light within the apartments and positioning furniture to do that. But it's also about having thick curtains, comfortable beds, good air conditioning, good control of temperature, thinking about the senses, and getting right down to sort of the granular level about how we can support physical and mental well-being through those nature connections, because it's really not always just about bringing plants or trees into a space. There are many other ways and mechanisms. Even the introduction of timber surfaces has been proven to reduce stress and heart rates. So, the quality of the materials, the colors, the textures, the patterning can all have a demonstrable effect on people's physiological experience in buildings. And what we want to do is create that kind of seamless journey from the exterior right the way through the building into the places where people feel safest and need to recuperate.
Yeah, and I think what's great, Oliver, I think, is we've got experiences that shows the differences along the entire journey point of our life, but also it extends throughout our lifetimes, as you know, from when we're kids through to when we're much older. You know, we need to think about those experiences of nature and the benefits it brings us throughout our lives, and it changes all the way, right? So children playing in parks means they get more solid bones. It helps accelerate their development. They learn better. So throughout our lifetimes, the benefit we gain from nature changes as well, and it's important to recognize and design for that from the outset. And part of it comes from creating multi-generational neighborhoods, because there's also that interconnection between generations that's fundamental to our health and well-being, not just the connection of nature. So it's the social and the nature connections that are important to really live fulfilled lives where we can be at our healthiest and our happiest. And there's a great program that's being led by the Agile Aging Alliance, who are leading on the UK input into the multi-generational neighborhood standard that's being developed as an ISO standard, and really helps bring together a lot of those concepts to say is actually, you know, neighborhoods of the future in an aging society where we all live in a more urban environment where we need contact to nature. How do we bring those parameters together with strategic decisions that allows us to really address all those issues at once? And there's also a great program we took part in that the NHS piloted back in 2015 that was called the Healthy New Towns. And it was a great study done by the NHS that realized the impact that living in new settlements has on our health and well-beings. Because it's not just us saying it, it's being recognized at all levels of government as well. And what they did was they put in place a learning program that's in a publication on the NHS website, where they selected 10 demonstrator sites and work collaboratively with those 10 new sort of towns, settlements, or neighborhoods to really amplify and set out what do new towns need to be healthy. It's a great complementary way of thinking about biophilia at a sort of city scale, and a lot of the recommendations kind of crossover, obviously, because there's synergies, just a slightly different approach as a starting point, but the end conclusion and the recommendations do align quite well.
I think it's a good point that you've mentioned, that a lot of what we've talked about, or I've talked about, has been very much about how nature supports the individual, and what Ludo is talking about aligns with our thinking as well. There's also what we call a socio-psychological approach, that actually when we have elements of nature in a built environment, it improves one's experience of space and place, and it puts us in a better physical and mental state of mind. And when we're feeling calmer and more relaxed and maybe less threatened by the overwhelming sensory inputs of a city, we're more likely to have positive conversations with people we don't necessarily fully know. And so by bringing nature in, it's a great way of strengthening an attachment to place, but also an attachment to groups of people within those places. A lovely example that it kind of brings it to life is that idea of when you go camping and you sit around a campfire and you gaze into the flames and you see the flickering flames, you feel the warmth, you've got the multi-sensory experience of the smell, the crackle of the logs. Maybe you're drinking a glass of wine or something that puts you in a better state. But it puts people in quite a different physical and mental state, that it just allows them to sort of wander off. And that sort of shared nature connection is something that we see in many places around the world where people stop and gather. You just think of kind of, when you travel and you see the kind of group of men sitting under the shade of a tree, just discussing the day. Nature brings people together, and it facilitates the opportunities for stronger communities to form. And that can happen at the kind of very small level in an individual home, but also within the wider public realm of putting people in that better physical and mental state, giving them a better experience of space, place, and the opportunity to share an idea, a conversation, maybe even a resource. So it's good for communities, and you take that into businesses. Maybe that's how we start to innovate and develop ideas through these sort of shared incidental moments of communication.
Well, and I think you've already got so many examples like this, right? Park runs, they're so popular, but what are they? their people experiences nature together through physical activity, right? It's not about running through the park the fastest as you can. It's about the experience of nature and the social connections you make along the way, right? So it's a real sort of catalyst that shows that, and I think that's what we found working, because we worked on 2 of the healthy new towns. What was really interesting was being able to talk with the clients who had completely different backgrounds and agendas, but seeing how the master plan and the solutions were starting to shape and converge towards sort of different local interpretation based on similar sound principles with regards to, well, what do we want that future community to do? What can we do so that we program and optimize how well they'll be able to use those spaces throughout the day, throughout the year, irrespective of their background or how active or healthy they are, and being able to have that level of thinking that doesn't just bring a landscape-led master plan, but actually, as you were saying, Oliver, earlier, brings that experience of nature and different scales and different users and different experiences well beyond just the experience of the shared public realm, but actually brings it also into the different lives of people. But I think the great ideas that we have discovered, thankfully, during COVID is that there's a lot of convergence around those motivations between health, nature, climate. All those things are starting to gain a very different momentum from our clients. There's many different incentives as well, right? And reasons why people would want to do it, ranging from regulatory incentives. And I think that I was saving that for maybe some of the biophobia section, but I think one of the reasons we're starting to see a much bigger pivot is not that it's just good for the bottom line or for climate. It's also, there's a lot of regulations that are starting to come into play that is also incentivizing the industry to shift in that direction, right? So the Environment Act is very much acted as a huge driver for that, not just with BNG, but with so many other incentives. But closing back on the point we were on, the thing with BNG and people is the 30-year stewardship. And I think there's something quite amazing that we will see developing going forward, and that's something that came with the garden villages, right? That idea of stewardship that we can see in Milton Keynes and other key settlements. And I think we're almost revisiting that idea of stewardship in the light of BNG and those 30-year stewardship considerations for, well, who's going to care for all that nature we're putting into the developments? Because it's not the developer, right? So who is it? What is it? What does it look like? And what are the benefits of that? Because actually there's so much good that can come out of that stewardship, from a nature and social prescribing through to fighting loneliness. There's so much good that can come out of those vehicles. They're not just there as regulated drivers. They can actually create completely new opportunities for society, and that's what's so exciting.
I think if it wasn't clear before, it definitely is now, that the benefits are somewhat endless. So my next question would be, with so many benefits to it, why do you think that there is still a sort of opposition from house builders and developers to build more developments with nature?
I suspect a lot of it comes down to a kind of financial constraints, and not realizing that the deeper, truer benefits. That if there is a singular desire for the house builder to create the development and then move on without having any continued involvement, then there isn't really a clear necessity for engaging and introducing nature. But if, like with build-to-rent schemes, there is a recognition that if they can get people in, attract them, encourage them to stay for longer through this connection with nature that has facilitated a stronger community, then there's obviously a clear return on investment.
Yeah, I would say there's probably two key points for me in this. One is simply going back to the basics. What's in the business plan? What's in that organization's driver? And as a result, what are they going to prioritize when it comes down to the financial investment, right? So that's where it all starts. But I think there will be developers who are more constrained on smaller sites in particular. And we're starting to have that conversation around BNG and small sites as well, because actually it's a lot more complex, especially from a stewardship perspective, right? So if you have homes with gardens, you sell the gardens. Obviously, go to the homeowners, but then you have the questions of the streets and the green assets on the streets. If the streets is adopted, you have less of a problem because the council will do it. But if you have a small enough development that has one street and maybe needs one stud and one play area, then it's quite kind of complicated when it only has 50 units on it to make it wash its face financially. And that's why a lot of people are not so much opposed to it, because they don't like nature. It's about making the financial case stack. When you're looking at it at much bigger scale, like in Barking Riverside, where you have 10,000 homes, you can create a community interest company that is going to look after all the green assets that are public in perpetuity, right? So you have a legacy company that's being set up behind that can actually do that stewardship, which means you're far less constrained with that idea of who's going to care for it thereafter, because you've left a corporate structure in your legacy for who's going to care for it. And it's really that sort of small to medium scale when it becomes a lot more difficult, where maybe the kick is not a solution, that it becomes more complicated, because it comes back down to who's going to pay for it and who's going to look after it, especially if the developer is not interested in staying on that site for the next 50 years to actually do that themselves, right? So I think that's really fundamentally the main hurdle. It's a financial one, more so than just realizing the benefit of it.
Do you think there's also a lot of competing demands on a house builder? I mean, should they be going for well or building with nature, or should they be going for any of these different types of approaches to building certification? And is biophilic design is actually sort of relatively undefined. I mean, it's included in many of them, like the World Building Standard and the Living Building Challenge. And of course, it's fundamental to building with nature. So maybe there is there's a risk that it's sort of there are many competing demands for those, and how they demonstrate the introduction or the kind of the proper implementation of these nature connections.
Yeah, and I think Oliver, sorry, Joe. I was just going to add there's obviously different triggers, right? You're going to have the regulatory triggers as to what's in the local plans and what is the planning authority looking for. You're going to have the national regulatory requirements, like that from the Environment Plan and BNG and others. And you're going to have voluntary certifications that come down to what does the organization want to achieve, right? Whether it's BREEAM Excellent, but sometimes some of those things are defined by planning. It's not just done out of the goodwill because you think it's what you want to commit to as an organization, and sometimes they do, right? There are some developers out there who will want to deliver BREEAM Excellent, but ultimately it's that combination of the regulatory triggers and requirements that aligns back to providing the supporting and incentives for those practices to be taken forward into action.
I think, as you mentioned, Oliver, there are different requirements, and perhaps house builders need to prioritise those which benefit them. And it comes down to the end of the day, is the financial reward there for them or not? So, would you say, Oliver, that you feel optimistic about the future development in this sense of overcoming this financial hurdle?
Yes, what we're seeing for sure is an increase in interest in the value that nature brings to the eventual outcome of that development. A recognition that it potentially creates a point of difference for the developer, but maybe also further roots a scheme in its environment, creating cultural and ecological connections to place, so that a space feels like it is somewhere, that it's part of a city, a town, a region. and not just another bland development, a sort of cookie cutter sort of replication of the thousands of other schemes that we see. And so I think this sort of nature connection is sort of absolutely fundamental to creating a value, identity, connection to community, individual physical and mental well-being, but also aligns with the sort of changing course and direction of people's values and sort of ideas of what the future might look like, not being something that is solely governed by greed and kind of financial wealth being paid to a developer, but also that there is some sense of giving back, that it has some sense of perpetuity, that there is some greater sense of legacy, that we're not, when the scheme was built, it's not just thinking about earning a quick buck, but also thinking about what is the implication of this scheme for future generations. So I think we're seeing this sort of slowly changing tide as a result of kind of, you could say, macro trends across society.
Yeah, I would agree. I think I would put it down to a couple of key drivers. One, the ESG drivers, right? I think we're seeing more incentives towards implementing your ESG strategy as early as possible into your master plan, and that's where biophilic design, building with nature, bringing that stewardship and social connectivity really comes in early into the process. And to a greater extent, impact investment, and we're seeing a lot more investors that are behind real estate companies being impact investors who are going to be interested more in the legacy of the place for people, nature, culture, resilience, beyond just the financial return, and valuing those impacts differently, because the societal benefit do not just need to be derived directly. It's also about creating a good economy, well beyond just the immediate envelope, and so I think those two key drivers, I think, if you combine that with a regulatory context, are going to help continue to spur a really positive drive towards embracing nature and everything it brings to our developments. And I think with the TNFD, Task Force for Nature Financial Disclosure, arising as a pilot in September, I think it's what it's going to do. It's going to have the same impact as the Task Force for Climate related financial disclosure has had on carbon and net zero. So it's everyone is at the moment on their pathway towards net zero, legally binding targets, and everyone is working hard towards that. And I think in terms of predictions, we're going to see the same thing happening with nature. It's still only in pilot form, but within the next 3 to 5 years, everyone will start to report back on their nature-related impacts and disclosures, and therefore be far more cognizant of one, minimizing, reducing, avoiding, but also enhancing the nature benefits of what they can provide in return. So I think we're coming, it feels like we're at kind of a pivotal moment, where really we might just about to start valuing nature for what it does provide. And nature, well, nature invented culture in a way, and so many Aboriginal cultures are born out of nature, and we've almost forgotten that. And I think there's something quite beautiful in what you've said earlier, Oliver, that actually being able to use nature and culture as to create unique places that make people feel home and like they belong is quite fundamental to making sure that that we start to use that as a foundation to how we approach new places. You're almost your primary objective becomes the health, the pride, and the social cohesion that comes from a well designed neighborhood, and then everything kind of flows with it.
Yeah. I mean, you've sort of spoken very poetically about the kind of changes and what we're likely to see over the next 3 to 5 years in the external environment. When you take those ideas into buildings and into residential spaces, I think we're going to start to see a far greater movement towards design being used as a force for good, not just for people, but also the wider environmental considerations. So design being seen as a kind of an opportunity to support people's physical and mental well-being, rather than just being used as a rather extrinsic design message to suggest you've bought into a luxury development. But so to go deeper, to say, that, if we can get you to be in a better physical and mental state, then you will come back feeling like you're delighted to be home, and you'll feel like you're somewhere that is connected to place. And when you get up in the morning, you'll feel more energized, more stimulated, more ready to tackle the problems and the issues that you're going to face ahead. We're going to be able to create spaces that support the well-being and the resilience of people's physical and mental well-being by connecting with nature, both inside and out, to create more meaningful, valuable places that are, really fit for the future.
Yeah, and I think the what's great in that, I think, Oliver, is we've seen a great shift over the past 20 years on the awareness of health and well-being, being able to talk about it, being able to pursue it actively, and no one feeling ashamed of it. Quite to the contrary, I think there's also generational shifts in how new generations are seeking health and well-being and climate resilience almost as default to what they're looking for in life and how they work and where they live. And so I think those generational shifts are also another reason why we're going to see, in terms of changes in the organizations, as those newer generations go into positions of leadership and power themselves to influence direction, then it's going to give yet again that next further shifts, because we definitely, not that it wasn't there in the older generations, but it's becoming far more the norm in the newer generations. I see it in my nephews, and when we're engaging with schools and communities and younger communities, it's not just becoming the exception of a few people who turn up at a consultation event. It's becoming far more the norm, where people feel like this is what they are looking for, because why wouldn't they? And so I think it just gives more ammunition as to why aren't we doing this, right?
Well, thank you very much, both of you. I would love to talk about this. I'm sure we could talk about it for much, much longer. I hope that the predictions that you've just mentioned do become a reality, because as we've spoken about, there are so many benefits to biophilic design and building in harmony with nature. And we do take great enjoyment from the moments that we spend with family and friends in those environments. So yeah, I suppose that only time will tell, and fingers crossed we continue to see further progression within this field over the next few years. Ludo, thank you very much. And Oliver, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Joseph. It's been a pleasure.